Dawn broke over the wreckage of Europe in silence. Smoke drifted across ruined streets where families once lived, and the echoes of marching boots had finally faded into the dust. Yet decades later, a new sound would stir that silence. The scrape of shovels in a forgotten field, the hiss of air as a sealed door cracked open. Inside, a vault no one was meant to find. Faded insignia, burnt documents, the smell of oil and rusted steel. What they uncovered would rewrite how the war was remembered and reveal a secret that history had chosen to forget. Chapter 1. Before the Storm. In the late 1930s, Europe was a continent holding its breath. The Great War had ended only 2 decades earlier, but its scars were still fresh. The cemeteries, the broken cities, the unspoken grief at dinner tables. People wanted peace. They wanted to believe the worst was behind them. But beneath that fragile calm, something was shifting. Borders were tightening. Economies were faltering. And in the beer halls and parliaments of a restless Germany, a new voice promised strength and revenge. Adolf Hitler had risen from obscurity to command a nation's attention. His words were precise, almost hypnotic. To many, he sounded like salvation. To others, a storm gathering on the horizon. Across the Channel, Britain watched with weary eyes, still nursing its own wounds. France, cautious but proud, clung to its fortifications along the Maginot Line. The United States, separated by oceans, remained focused inward, more concerned with the Depression than with Europe's mounting tension. And yet, the world could feel something coming. Ordinary people carried on as best they could. In Berlin, shopkeepers opened their shutters at dawn, pretending not to notice the new banners lining the streets. In Warsaw, children played beside the Vistula River, unaware their homeland would soon be the first battleground. In London, newspapers debated whether Hitler was simply bluster or genuine threat. And in Moscow, Joseph Stalin's purges filled prisons and work camps, his paranoia spreading through every level of Soviet life. No one trusted anyone. Not fully, not anymore. Factories roared to life again, this time not for rebuilding, but for rearming. In the Ruhr Valley, steel mills began producing weapons instead of tools. Japan pushed deeper into China, testing the limits of international patience. In Italy, Mussolini's fascist vision marched hand in hand with Germany's ambitions. And still, diplomats met around polished tables, their signatures flowing across treaties that would soon mean nothing. Each handshake was a performance, each promise a stall for time. In the cafes of Paris, poets and soldiers argued over espresso about whether another war was even possible in the modern age. It cannot happen again, they said, not after the millions we buried. But far from the comfort of Europe's capitals, the machinery of conflict was already in motion. Engineers designing new bombers, chemists refining fuel, generals sketching maps on chalkboards under dim lights. Every nation was preparing, though none would admit it out loud. In the skies above Spain, German and Italian pilots were already testing tactics under the guise of civil war. Cities like Guernica became laboratories of destruction, the world's first modern bombed civilians. Observers from Britain and France took notes, horrified yet fascinated. They saw the future of warfare unfold in fire and smoke, and still no one stopped it. The League of Nations condemned, but its words carried no force. The embers of one war had lit the fuse of the next. Meanwhile, in quiet offices beneath ministries and embassies, the unseen world of intelligence was awakening. Cipher machines hummed. Messages were intercepted, decoded, and buried in classified archives. Somewhere in Warsaw, Polish mathematicians were already studying the German enigma, unaware that their work would one day help turn the tide of the war. These were small, unseen acts of resistance, the first quiet moves in a global chess game no one fully understood. By 1938, the illusion of peace was cracking. Germany reoccupied the Rhineland, then absorbed Austria in a wave of nationalistic fervor. Crowds cheered in Vienna as swastikas draped the city's facades. One people, one empire, they shouted. Britain and France protested but did not act. Appeasement, they called it, an effort to buy peace with concessions. In Munich, Chamberlain returned to London holding a piece of paper, declaring peace for our time. But history would soon remember it as the calm before catastrophe. On the outskirts of Prague, Czech soldiers watched the border lights flicker, knowing the promises made in Munich would not protect them. And in Berlin, the Reich's factories now ran day and night, their smokestacks rising like black fingers against the sky. Hitler's vision of a 1,000-year Reich demanded expansion, and the question was no longer if, but when. As 1939 dawned, families across Europe still celebrated the new year with hope. Radios played waltzes and news bulletins spoke of progress. Yet somewhere deep down, even the most optimistic citizens could sense it. That faint vibration in the air before a storm. The world was walking in its sleep toward a precipice, guided by pride, fear, and denial. And soon, the sound of marching boots would return, echoing once more across the continent. Chapter 2. The Descent into War. By the summer of 1939, diplomacy had become theatre. Every meeting, every telegram was a performance, a desperate attempt to hold back the inevitable. Hitler's ambitions were no longer hidden. His speeches thundered with confidence. Germany must have living space, he declared, before roaring crowds in Berlin. The promise of glory drowned out the whispers of doubt. Across Europe, fear tightened its grip. In the corridors of power, men in tailored suits and polished shoes played a dangerous game. Britain's Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain clung to appeasement like a lifeline, convinced that negotiation could temper tyranny. In Moscow, Joseph Stalin watched from behind cold eyes, calculating where the wind would blow. When the German envoy arrived in August with a secret proposal, Stalin did not hesitate. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty between mortal enemies, was signed in a smoke-filled Kremlin chamber. Its hidden clause divided Eastern Europe like a carcass on a map, half for Hitler, half for Stalin. On September the 1st, the illusion of peace shattered. German tanks roared across the Polish border before dawn, their engines echoing through the mist. Dive bombers screamed overhead, their sirens weaponized to sow terror. Civilians fled down muddy roads, carts loaded with everything they could carry. The Blitzkrieg, lightning war, had begun. Within days, Polish defenses crumbled under the combined assault of air power and mechanized armor, a new kind of warfare the world had never seen. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war. Their words were solemn but slow to act. "This country is at war with Germany," announced Chamberlain over the radio, his voice steady but hollow. In London's pubs, the news rippled like a chill wind. Across Europe, families gathered around radios, their faces pale with realization. The world had plunged into darkness again. In the following months, Europe fell quiet, a deceptive pause historians would later call the phony war. Troops dug trenches along the Western Front, staring across no man's land at the enemy who never came. Soldiers played cards in the mud. Letters home spoke of boredom, not battle. Yet behind that eerie calm, plans were forming in Berlin. Hitler was waiting for the right moment to strike west. Then came spring. In May 1940, Germany unleashed its fury across the Low Countries. Belgium and the Netherlands were crushed in days. The Maginot Line, that proud symbol of French security, was outflanked and rendered useless. Panzer divisions raced through the Ardennes, a forest the French thought impassable. And by June, Paris had fallen. The City of Light dimmed beneath Nazi banners. Refugees flooded south, clutching children, photographs, and whatever hope they had left. France, humiliated and broken, signed an armistice in the same railway carriage where Germany had surrendered in 1918. History, it seemed, had a cruel sense of symmetry. In Britain, the mood shifted from denial to defiance. Winston Churchill, newly appointed Prime Minister, stood before Parliament with his unmistakable gravelled tone. "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears and sweat." His words became a rallying cry for a nation on the brink. Across the Channel, Hitler prepared Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain, confident that the island would soon kneel. But before his armies could cross the water, he needed to control the skies. The Battle of Britain began that summer. The Luftwaffe's bombers darkened the skies over London, Coventry and Portsmouth. Air raid sirens wailed night after night as families rushed into shelters, clutching radios and photographs. Above the clouds, young RAF pilots, many barely 20 years old, fought with desperate precision. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few, Churchill later said. It was not just a battle for territory, it was a battle for survival. And against all odds, Britain held frustrated. Hitler turned east. His gaze shifted toward the Soviet Union, the vast expanse he saw as both threat and prize. In June 1941, German forces launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history. 3 million men poured across the border, their boots grinding into the soil of a land they believed they could conquer in months. Villages burned, entire Soviet divisions vanished in encirclements. And yet, as autumn deepened, the tide began to turn. The Russian winter arrived early and merciless. Tanks froze, soldiers starved. What began as a triumph became a slow, freezing nightmare. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States was watching closely. President Franklin D. Roosevelt knew neutrality could not last. "We must be the arsenal of democracy," he declared, sending weapons and aid to Britain under the Lend-Lease Act. But America's entry into the war would come not from Europe, but from the Pacific. On December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor. In minutes, battleships burned and thousands died. The next day, Roosevelt's calm but thunderous words echoed through Congress. A date which will live in infamy. The World War had become truly global. As the Axis powers expanded, Germany across Europe, Japan across Asia, Italy across Africa, resistance began to grow in the shadows. In France, underground networks formed. In Poland, partisans operated in forests and fields, sabotaging rail lines. Even within Germany, quiet dissent simmered. Diaries, smuggled letters, whispered conversations, all carried a single question. How much longer could humanity bear the weight of its own destruction? By 1942, cities burned nightly from London to Leningrad. The world was divided into two realities, the occupied and the free. And for those caught in between, survival meant choices no one should ever have to make. As tanks rolled, as leaders spoke of destiny and empire, ordinary men and women were left with nothing but endurance. The descent into war was complete, and there was no turning back. Chapter 3: The Inferno at Stalingrad. By the autumn of 1942, the war had reached its breaking point. The Nazi war machine, once unstoppable, was grinding through the frozen steppes of southern Russia. Hitler's obsession had shifted toward a single name on the map, Stalingrad. To him, it was more than a city. It was a symbol. To take it would humiliate Stalin, prove German dominance, and secure the oil fields of the Caucasus. But for the men on the ground, it would become a living hell. The approach to Stalingrad was a wasteland of ash and smoke. Villages lay in ruins. Roads were lined with the blackened shells of tanks and trucks, frozen where they had fallen. The Volga River, once a ribbon of trade and life, had turned to a corridor of death. German artillery thundered day and night, reducing entire districts to rubble. Civilians, the ones who hadn't fled, were trapped in basements and sewers, surviving on melted snow and crumbs. "We could no longer tell where the front line was," wrote one Soviet nurse. The whole city was the front. The Luftwaffe bombed the city relentlessly. Firestorms consumed the skyline. Brick by brick, Stalingrad disintegrated into a maze of twisted iron and shattered walls. And still, the Soviet defenders held. They fought for every building, every stairwell, every room. Snipers hid in the shadows of broken factories. Machine gunners waited in schoolhouses filled with dust and glass. In the ruins of the Red October steel plant, entire battalions disappeared in the smoke. Time itself stopped, one survivor later said. There was only hunger, gunfire, and the stench of death. On the German side, confidence began to fracture. General Paulus, commanding the Sixth Army, sent reports to Berlin warning of stretched supply lines and mounting casualties. But Hitler refused retreat. Stalingrad must be taken, he ordered. At any cost. Those words sealed the fate of thousands. When winter closed in, temperatures dropped to -40. Fuel froze in engines, rifles jammed. Wounded soldiers froze where they fell. The snow turned red beneath them. Inside the city, the Soviets counterattacked with ferocity. Under General Zhukov's command, the Red Army launched Operation Uranus, a massive pincer movement designed to encircle the Germans. It worked. Within weeks, Paulus's entire army was trapped. Over 300,000 Axis soldiers were surrounded, their lifeline to the outside world severed. Hitler promised resupply by air, but the Luftwaffe could deliver only a fraction of what was needed. Hunger set in. Horses were slaughtered, then dogs, then rats. Soldiers tore pages from prayer books to roll cigarettes, praying not for victory, but for warmth. Letters recovered from German archives decades later speak of despair. "We live like ghosts," one lieutenant wrote. "We dig graves we cannot fill. We no longer feel fear, only exhaustion." In the Soviet trenches, the mood was no better. For every step forward, hundreds fell, but they would not yield. Not a step back, Stalin's order demanded. In the frozen ruins, That phrase became both curse and creed. The fighting inside Stalingrad defied all logic. Buildings changed hands multiple times a day. Soldiers fought hand-to-hand in corridors filled with smoke and dust. Grenades rolled across broken floors like dice deciding who would live and who would die. Artillery from both sides pounded the same ground endlessly, as if the city itself were being punished for existing. And through it all, the civilians, the old, the wounded, the children, endured. They huddled in cellars, wrapping themselves in blankets of rags, whispering songs of hope beneath the roar of shells. By January 1943, the encircled Germans were finished. Frostbite ate through their limbs. Ammunition was gone. The dead lay in frozen heaps, their faces grey, their eyes open. General Paulus, once celebrated as a brilliant tactician, now sat in a bunker beneath the ruins of a department store. He requested permission to surrender. Hitler's response was blunt. Surrender is forbidden. The Sixth Army will stand or die. But even fanaticism could not hold back starvation. On February 2nd, Paulus surrendered unconditionally. 91,000 men were taken prisoner. Fewer than 5,000 would ever return home. The victory came at an unbearable cost. Over 1 million Soviet soldiers and civilians were dead or wounded. The city was unrecognizable, a ghost of concrete and bone. Stalin called it the turning point of the war, and it was. The myth of German invincibility was broken. From that moment, the Red Army began its relentless push westward. Yet for the survivors, glory was an empty word. They had seen too much, lost too much. We did not win, one Russian veteran said years later. We simply lived while others did not. Stalingrad became a word carved into memory, not for triumph, but for suffering. It was the moment when the war turned, when the hunter became the hunted. And though the city would be rebuilt, the ground beneath it would always whisper. If you walk there today, on a quiet winter morning, the wind still moves through the ruins like a sigh, the sound of a city that refused to die. Chapter 4: Ashes and Echoes. When the guns finally fell silent, Europe no longer recognized itself. The war that had begun with speeches and flags ended in silence and ruin. Cities once filled with laughter were now nothing but broken walls and empty streets. In Warsaw, the air smelled of smoke long after the fires were gone. Berlin was rubble, a grey wasteland of collapsed stone and shattered glass. The great capitals of the world stood like wounded giants, and the people who survived walked among the ruins, trying to remember how to begin again. The human cost was beyond comprehension. Families were erased from the record. Entire towns vanished under bombing maps. The Holocaust had revealed the deepest horror of all: industrialized murder. As Allied troops advanced through Poland and Germany, they stumbled upon the concentration camps. The gates of Auschwitz, Buchenwald, and Dachau creaked open, revealing scenes that no soldier could ever forget. Skeletal survivors stood in silence, eyes sunken, faces without expression. The liberators wept. Hardened men dropped their weapons and stared at the piles of shoes. The ashes, the absence of life. I felt I had stepped out of the world, one British sergeant wrote, and into hell. Across the continent, millions of refugees wandered roads leading nowhere. Children carried their homes on their backs. Mothers searched for sons who would never return. Soldiers came home to find no home at all, only ruins and empty fields where houses once stood. The victors, too, carried invisible scars. American troops who stormed Normandy, Soviet soldiers who marched from Stalingrad to Berlin, British airmen who flew through fire. They had survived, but they would never be the same. In Berlin, the Red Army raised its flag over the Reichstag. Hitler was dead. A coward's suicide beneath the ruins of his dream. The Führer's voice, once so loud, was now nothing but a whisper in history. Goebbels, Göring, Himmler, all gone. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted barely 12. But even in its collapse, it left behind an empire of destruction that would take generations to rebuild. The victors faced a new challenge, not how to win a war, but how to live after one. The Nuremberg trials began in late 1945. In a courtroom filled with translators, judges, and the weight of 6 million dead, the architects of genocide were forced to answer for their crimes. The world heard for the first time the full machinery of Nazi terror. The transport lists, the ledgers, the orders signed in ink. It was not madness or chaos, but paperwork, precision, obedience. One of the judges called it the coldest evil imaginable. Some defendants showed remorse. Most did not. Justice was served, though it could never balance the scale of loss. In the East, the Soviet Union bore its own wounds. 27 million dead, cities erased, farmland scorched to desert. And yet, from the ashes, Stalin emerged stronger, his gaze already fixed on new borders, new enemies. As Western troops withdrew, a new shadow fell across Europe, the beginning of another kind of war, the Cold War. The Iron Curtain descended quietly, made not of steel, but of mistrust. The same rail lines that once carried soldiers now carried spies. Meanwhile, across oceans, America wrestled with its own conscience. The atomic bomb had ended the war in the Pacific. Hiroshima and Nagasaki reduced to vapor and dust. "I am become death, the destroyer of worlds," Oppenheimer murmured, quoting scripture with hollow eyes. The weapon that had brought victory also brought fear, for now mankind held the power to end itself. Every nation, rebuilding, understood that peace had become fragile, a balance held not by trust, but by deterrence. And yet, amid the ruins, life began to return. In France, people swept broken glass from cafe floors and reopened their doors. In the Netherlands, farmers plowed through rusted helmets to plant crops. In Germany, rubble women, Trümmerfrauen, formed human chains, clearing bricks by hand to rebuild their cities. It was slow, grueling work, but it was proof that humanity still had strength left. A Berlin child wrote in her diary, "We have no toys, but we have light again." That single line captured more hope than any treaty could promise. Music returned too. So did laughter, though quieter now, tempered by memory. Photographs from 1946 show couples dancing in bombed-out halls, an orchestra playing beside crumbling walls. The melodies were fragile, but real. The war had stripped away illusions, leaving behind only the raw, stubborn instinct to keep going. Every song, every rebuilt street, was an act of defiance against the darkness. For soldiers who came home, peace was often harder than war. Nightmares followed them. Empty chairs at kitchen tables reminded them who hadn't made it. Some never spoke of what they'd seen. Others spoke only in fragments. "We left something of ourselves there," said one veteran, "and I don't think we ever got it back." For many, the war never truly ended. It simply became part of their silence. In the East and West, children grew up playing in the ruins of their parents' battles. They learned history not from books, but from what was missing. The uncle who never returned, the mother who stared too long at the horizon. Europe's soil became sacred, not through religion, but through memory. Every field, every river held stories buried beneath it, and so the survivors rebuilt, not because they had forgotten, but because they refused to forget. They carried the ghosts with them quietly, like shadows that never left. In their resilience, the world found its first fragile peace. But peace built on ashes is delicate. One wrong step, and it could all burn again. Chapter 5: The Weight of Memory. Time moved on, but the war never truly ended. It lived in photographs and letters, in stories whispered by those who could not sleep. By the 1950s, the world was rebuilding faster than anyone thought possible. Cities rising from ruins, nations redrawing themselves. Yet beneath the progress, the memories still lingered like the faint smell of smoke after a fire. For millions, the war was not history. It was something they carried inside them every day. In Germany, a generation grew up surrounded by silence. Their parents rarely spoke of what they had done, or what they had seen. Schools taught lessons carefully, often in half-truths. It took decades before the country began to confront its past openly. Young Germans would ask, "Where was my grandfather during the war?" And sometimes there was no answer. In that silence, the weight of guilt turned into a responsibility. To remember, to never repeat, to build something better. In the Soviet Union, memory took another shape. Victory became sacred. The Great Patriotic War was rewritten as legend, a story of unbroken heroism and sacrifice. The reality, the purges, the forced marches, the millions dead, was hidden beneath banners and parades. In every city, statues rose to the fallen, and for many, they were both pride and burden. Veterans stood in silence each May 9th, medals glinting in the sun, remembering comrades who had never returned from Stalingrad or Kursk. Behind their eyes, the war was still there. For the Allies, the post-war years brought their own reckoning. The United States, now a superpower, carried both triumph and fear. The nuclear age had dawned, and the line between victory and annihilation grew thin. Britain, scarred and weary, slowly watched its empire fade into history. France rebuilt with determination, but never forgot the humiliation of occupation. And across all of them, there was the quiet, unspoken understanding that the world had changed forever. Human ambition had met its limit and crossed it. Then came the Cold War. Barbed wire replaced battlefields. Bombers carried weapons that could erase cities in moments. Spies became soldiers of a different kind, fighting with secrets instead of bullets. The old alliances shifted. Suspicion replaced celebration. The Iron Curtain cut Europe in half, and the same nations that had fought together now glared at one another across walls of ideology. Peace existed, but it was fragile, conditional, tense. Still, people found ways to live. The same generation that had seen the war's worst horrors became the architects of its peace. They built institutions, treaties, and systems designed to prevent another catastrophe. The United Nations, NATO, the European Community, all born from the same desperate hope. Never again. Yet with every new crisis, that phrase was tested. Korea, Vietnam, Hungary, Prague. The lessons of the 1940s echoed faintly, sometimes heeded, sometimes ignored. Decades passed. Survivors aged. Their stories, once vivid, began to fade from living memory. But history has a way of resurfacing. In old bunkers, in sealed archives, in forgotten boxes of letters, fragments of truth still emerge. A film reel showing a city before the bombs, a diary found beneath a floorboard, a rusted dog tag unearthed by a child's shovel. Each discovery reminds us that the past is never as distant as we imagine. The war may have ended, but its shadow still moves across our world. Today, the grandsons of soldiers stand on the same fields their ancestors fought upon. Tourists walk through the quiet streets of Warsaw, the beaches of Normandy, the hills of Italy. Places once soaked in blood, now green and peaceful. They take photographs, unaware of how much silence those landscapes hold. Beneath every stone, beneath every rebuilt home, history still breathes. And if you listen carefully, you can almost hear it. The faint echo of marching boots, the crackle of radio static, the heartbeat of a world that once stood on the edge of destruction. The lessons of the Second World War are not written in monuments or dates. They live in empathy, in our ability to look back and feel what others felt. Fear, hunger, hope, the knowledge that civilization is far more fragile than we want to believe. When those lessons are forgotten, history begins to repeat itself, quietly, with familiar words and familiar lies. Yet there is hope in remembrance. Each generation that studies the war, that preserves its stories, weakens the darkness that caused it. Memory becomes a form of resistance against ignorance, against indifference, against time itself. The survivors of that era are almost gone now. Their voices tremble, their eyes clouded, but their message remains clear. We remember so that you don't have to live it again, and so the world continues, imperfect, uncertain, but still standing. The cities rebuilt, the wounds never fully healed, the names etched in stone, countless and sacred. Every anniversary, every wreath laid, every candle lit is a small promise whispered to the past. A promise to never forget what human hands are capable of, both in destruction and in rebuilding. Because when the last eyewitness is gone and the echoes of their stories fade into history books, only one question will remain. What will we do with the memory they left behind? The answer, perhaps, is the truest measure of peace.